For Photoshop Tennis Week 3, I wanted to give you guys a video that showed some of the selection techniques I showed in class in a more duplicated, pause and start fashion. The things I wanted to cover were selections, channels, quick masks, and layer masks, and perhaps a bit of just generic Photoshop hotkeys and good workflows. So one of the first things that you'll notice is how I organize my files. I was, just thinking about what should I do for this. And of course, the presidential debate just happened. And if you go to Twitter, you'll find, ooh, what's this? Trending is Ken Bone, who was one of the people in the most recent debate. So memes happen really fast. You got to jump on this, guys. So I decided to put Ken Bone in mine and do some sort of Ken Bone tribute. Now, when I found this image of Ken Bone, I thought, I can either make it about him or I can insert him into something else. And I also had to obey the rules of Photoshop Tennis, which it means that I have to include some part of one of somebody else's week 2 Photoshop Tennis assignment. So I was thinking, well, I started with just selections, and then I decided, especially when I was trying to crop here, I should keep these people in the right, like behind him, because it's like they're backing him up, and so then I was like, maybe it would be Ken Bone assembles a crew or something. So the final, dumb piece is this, right? I think there's one more. Ken Bone brings whole squad. Who is Ken Bone? That's a, I don't know, Atlas Shrugged reference. All right. So how do I go about this? Well, the first thing to know is that in Photoshop and in most processes, you want to be non-destructive. So when I go and I find this image and I just copy and paste it into Photoshop, whatever. Imagine I copied and pasted it. Then I want to create a duplicate that I can start working on. So before all of this junk, you'll notice that there was this giant pile of there's this big pile of all of my reference. So when I start working on a file, that way I can make sure that I'm not being destructive. So then I use this Ken Bone picture and I start making masks. So let's see if I can recreate this a little bit. Let me select all these, put them in a folder called finished. By the way, when you drag an element down in Photoshop to this layer button, it duplicates, in case you weren't aware of that. So there's the finished one. So let's start with Ken Bone. How do I get a good selection on him? Well, first I'll drag it down to duplicate it, and I'll drag it out of the reference folder. And the first thing I need to do is make a selection around him. Now again, as we talked about in class, there's lots of terrible ways to do selections. You might use the magic wand tool and say, I'll select this blue. Well, again, try hitting the Q key for quick mask, and the quick mask will give you a red versus non-red selection idea. So I can see the literal pixels that I've selected here. And you can see that the magic wand, even if it aliases a little bit, it's never going to give you exactly what you want. It's okay for things where perhaps it's a man-made pattern or something, or it's coming from a vector-based workflow, and then your selections will end up pretty clean. But from photos, it's generally a bad idea. Again, you can toggle quick mask with Q. Notice the little hotkeys that you can see here. Now the nice thing about quick mask is if you were really, really desperate, you could keep this and then you could actually paint this selection. So I could switch to the brush tool, and this is really nice because it lets me affect selections, which is just black and white data, in a more painterly, artsy-fartsy fashion. And really that's what we want, right? We want to take as much of this to the computer level as possible. or what I mean is that we want to use as much of this in an artistic fashion as possible. And generally what that means in my case is what you want selected. And if this was a coloring book, you could fill that in. And we could actually just, go to Quick Mask and manually paint in Ken Bone's selection. But the best way to do it is through channels. So you can see here all of these old channels that I've made. And these are basically examples of how I used the channels to get a good selection off of the photographic data and then modify a little bit of it, and then you can use that as a selection. And this is always available. So if I name this Ken Bone, there's a couple of ways I could apply this. I could control click on this, and when you control click on any layer or channel, it loads that selection. When you're looking at this channel, this is viewing the black and white data. So if you ever want to get back to your multiple channels or your RGB channels, go here. So for instance, if you ever can't understand why your image might have suddenly lost all its color and you're like, did I accidentally desaturate it? What happened? It might have been that you accidentally clicked into one of these channels. Or, as you can see here, maybe you accidentally pressed 1, 2, 3. Anyways, when I have a channel selected, I can paint on it. And if I had one of these selected, I could load that selection. So I could go select, load selection, and find that Ken Bone selection and load it if I wanted. However, I'm going to modify this first and make a fresh selection. So again, all these are is black and white representations of selections. And the first thing I often do is I'll find the layer that has, or the channel that has the highest contrast. Now Ken Bone is wearing this handsome red sweater, and so as a result the red channel has really, really strong contrast. This is something we can use, and that's really what you want to think about with selections is what is the data that I need and how is the best way to go about getting it. So I dragged that red copy down here, and that created a duplicate layer. And now what I can do is I can start using the levels. Control L brings up levels, and this lets me change how dark my darks are and how white my whites are. I can say make them darker, or I could perhaps bring them down. So if you wanted a more saturated or a less contrasty image, you could just bring the output levels in. Or in our case, what we want to do is we want to make that contrast stronger. Now what I'm looking at is things like the specular highlights along these people's hair, and that's sort of my gauge of when it's too hot or too cold. So something like that. And there's no such thing as a perfect selection. So you just kind of get what you can. Now this image, and again you can see this is down here. If I control clicked on it, that would load it as a selection rather than as the channel that we're looking at. So now I could click back on over here and I could apply that. Now dancing ants are always a lie in Photoshop because what they're telling you is just a best guess of what's selected and what's not, and it's either on or off. There's no such thing as a painted gradient. But if we hit Q to see the quick mask, you can see that there's pixels that are at 1, 10, 25%, 75% selection. It's not an on or off thing. So don't trust your dancing ants when you see it. Going back to the channels, I'm actually going to hit Control D to deselect. And now I'm going to modify this because this, it's not a perfect selection, right? But it's gotten me nearly enough there, and it's very easy to see where I could just paint this stuff by hand now. So if I can see this highlight of her hair, I can just assume that everything up until that is painted in white. And all of the things that the modified channel accidentally grabbed, such as Ken Bone's silky smooth eyes, I can just erase away. In fact, the entirety of this stuff. And I'm just using a really hard brush saying goodbye to that. So now there's a new problem, which is, what about this stuff? We understand the data that we want, right? We want her hair, but how do we go about getting it? Well, I could paint it in like this, and perhaps at this point your thought process might tell you that brush is too hard, so let's use a softer one, but then you might accidentally go out of bounds. And clearly we could be doing this in a way that doesn't jump into this sort of user accidentally causes problems method. So I'm going to use selections again to get a high contrast version that has what I need. So when we originally used the red channel, it worked for the background, which was blue, and his sweater, which was red. But what about things like her hair, which is a little more close to the background? Well, for that it looks like green is the best selection. And you can see the same thing with Ken, I think. See that? The green has a little bit better contrast. So let's just make another selection. And I'm going to modify this one specifically looking at those hair outlines, because that's where my cutoff point is. Control L for the levels. Right around there. And that might not be perfect, but I have this highlight that's correctly getting the hair, and I can always go back in and paint everything up until that highlight. So what do I do now? I will select this as a selection and use that to paint on my other selection. True Ken. Okay, so this is the one that has our nice outline that we can utilize as data. I'll control click on it, go back over here, and start modifying that. Again, this is another example of where the dancing ants will fool you. You might see this and say, the dancing ants tell me I didn't select this highlight. Well, in Quick Mask, you can see there's a little bit of white there where it is selected. And in fact, you can hit Q for Quick Mask, and even now modify your levels. Remember, if it's selected at 20% and therefore not showing fully, you could always go over it with a brush multiple times. So my theory right now is that I want to get this selection in with a nice edge, and there's things that are not going to successfully get covered when I do this, but I can always go back in and modify those by hand. Ah, crap. I gotta undo this because I was painting on the wrong layer. This is the one that I want to paint on. So now I'm combining my original starting mask with my secondary mask. That's just helping me get to that final punch. And now is a good time where I might just call it quits and Control D to deselect. Zoom in, bracket keys to grow or shrink your brush. And for this kind of thing, once I've got that final edge, I tend to use these hard brushes. I'll sometimes hit, if it's too hard, I'll hit Shift and some number on the keyboard, such as Shift 5. That's showing up on this hotkey display as percentile. And what that does is it modifies the flow. So what that means is this brush will have a slower effect on the pixels as I paint them. And that's pretty good. So now that I have this selection, what do I do to it? Well, I could control click it, go to my layers, and on this Ken picture, invert my selection and delete. Hey, look, now I have that selection. That's a dumb thing to do. Why is that dumb? Well, again, what we always care about is, are we being destructive? And don't get me wrong, there's plenty of times that I think having a destructive workflow is really good. My paint process is very much always paint on one layer with one brush when I'm doing illustration. And the reason for that is totally just because, as you saw when I was painting on this channel over here, it's very easy if you're trying to be too organized and too non-destructive. You'll just get confused and paint on the wrong layer. The best way to do this is actually to save this as a selection on Ken, as a personal selection for this layer. So if I control click on True Ken, or if you want to be a dork, you can say select, load selection, True Ken. I can now apply this as a mask with the mask button down here. So this will create a layer mask. Add layer mask. What does a layer mask do? Well, that's the next option. The nice thing about a layer mask is it doesn't destroy those pixels. So I'm going to make this, I'm going to bring out another one of my old reference files. So this was from, I believe, Malika's submission. I can put it up here. And now I have this background as our start. And you can see that maybe this selection isn't so good right off the bat. So there's a little bit too much edge pixel. I can do things like now, instead of having deleted those pixels and never been able to modify them, I could possibly adjust this, bring in that choke. But also, what happens if you had deleted that layer instead of using a mask? And all of a sudden, these holes that you accidentally put in his mustache, well, they're permanent. But with a mask, I can, instead of being on the layer, I can be on the mask and paint on it. So I can just paint away those holes. It's not affecting the layer, it's just affecting where that layer shows up. I could also modify the selection with the dodge and burn tool. The dodge tool makes light pixels lighter, and the burn tool does the opposite. It makes dark pixels darker. You can change the settings here. But as an example of this, if I, again, I'm going to control click on this layer mask so that it selects it and look at it over here. What we're seeing is some amount of the feathering right here, and it looks like I just need to literally pull that in a little bit more. So instead of erasing this layer like this to get that effect, I can instead just use the brush tool with black and erase. So take a look at this finished one. Every single one of these layers is just one of those default starting layers with a layer mask. So I started with this one as a background plate. And again, you don't have to use every single option from last week's Photoshop tennis. You could just get this one tower and stick it in somebody's mouth so it looks like they're smoking a cigarette. You can do something really small. But this has its own layer mask. Also, in addition to control click to look at this, remember how nice it was to go into the channels and literally see the black and white data of what's selected or what's not? You might miss that, and it's good to know that you can actually alt click on this to switch between viewing the layers or viewing a personal layer mask. So even though you're not in the channels anymore, you can still get to this data with alt click. And shift click turns the mask on and off. So this is with the mask, and therefore we can see this dancing lady on top of this background. Shift click, we no longer see the selection. So this whole image is viewable. Same thing with this one. And again, layer masks aren't always the answer. This particular image, which I think if we look at my, if you look at my source material, this one had, oh, do I not have it? Oh, apparently I don't have a copy of this one. Well, then let's just look in here. So in this image, I flipped it, but she is against a very dark green background and getting reflected light from her arm, or from this chair onto her arm that's very red. So when I go into the channels and look at this, you'll notice that it gets very, very confused about where these selections are. So this was one where, especially with all this white noise in the trees, I ended up, and the noise on her dress from the fabric pattern, this is an example of one where I did end up using a lot more hand lassoing and magnet lassoing. But in general, layers have power. Anyways, thanks for watching, guys. I hope this helps you with Photoshop tennis.